Captain Sarah Martinez walked into the briefing room at Forward Operating Base Thunder, her boots clicking against the concrete floor. The morning sun cast long shadows through the small windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny stars. She carried her helmet under her arm and a steaming cup of black coffee in her free hand. To everyone around her, she looked like just another pilot getting ready for another routine mission. The other pilots barely looked up when she entered. Most of them were men who had been flying combat missions for years. They respected her enough, but they saw her as the quiet one, the careful one, the pilot who always followed orders but never stood out. Sarah had earned her wings 3 years ago, but somehow she always ended up on the easier missions while the more experienced pilots took on the dangerous targets. "Morning, Martinez," called out Major Thompson, the squadron leader. He was a tall man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. "You're on escort duty today. Transport helicopters need cover while they move supplies to Outpost Eagle." Sarah nodded and took her seat in the back row. Around her, the other pilots chatted about their assignments. Lieutenant Jackson was going on a reconnaissance mission deep in enemy territory. Captain Rodriguez will be providing close air support for ground troops engaged in heavy fighting. Captain Williams had been assigned to hunt down enemy vehicles that had been attacking supply convoys. "Sounds like another boring day for Martinez," Jackson whispered to the pilot next to him, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Maybe she'll get to fire her weapons if a bird flies too close to the transport." A few pilots chuckled, but Sarah kept her face neutral. She had heard comments like this before. They thought she was too cautious, too by the book, too ordinary to handle the real fighting. What they didn't know was that Sarah had been top of her class in every training program she had completed. Her instructors had praised her precision, her tactical thinking, and her ability to stay calm under pressure. But somehow, none of that seemed to matter here. Major Thompson began the mission briefing, pointing to a large map displayed on the wall. Red markers showed known enemy positions, while blue markers indicated friendly forces. The area they would be operating in was a valley surrounded by hills and rocky outcroppings, perfect terrain for enemy forces to hide and launch surprise attacks. Intelligence reports suggest increased enemy activity in this region, Thompson explained. "We've lost contact with 2 patrols in the last week, and local sources report seeing enemy vehicles moving through the area at night. Everyone needs to stay alert." Sarah studied the map carefully, noting the terrain features and potential threats. She had spent hours studying this area in satellite photos and topographical maps. She knew every ridge, every valley, every potential hiding spot where enemy forces might wait in ambush. While the other pilots focused on their primary targets, Sarah had made it her habit to learn everything about every mission area, even the ones she wasn't directly involved in. After the briefing, the pilots headed to their aircraft. Sarah's Apache helicopter sat on the flight line, its sleek profile making it look like a mechanical predator ready to hunt. She conducted her pre-flight inspection with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Every system was checked, every weapon was verified, every piece of equipment was tested. Her gunner for today's mission was Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez, an experienced crew member who had flown dozens of combat missions. Gonzalez was known for her sharp eyes and quick reflexes, but even she seemed to view this mission as routine. "Another milk run," Gonzalez said as she climbed into the front seat of the Apache. "At least it's better than sitting around the base all day." Sarah strapped herself into the pilot's seat and began the startup sequence. The Apache's twin engines came to life with a low whine that gradually built to a steady roar. She ran through her checklist one more time, making sure every system was functioning perfectly. The aircraft carried a full load of ammunition for its 30mm chain gun, plus Hellfire missiles and rockets that could destroy tanks and fortified positions. The radio crackled to life as the tower cleared them for takeoff. Sarah lifted the Apache into the air smoothly, feeling the familiar sensation of the aircraft responding to her touch. Flying had always felt natural to her, like the helicopter was an extension of her own body. She could sense every vibration, hear every change in the engine note, feel every shift in the wind. The transport helicopters were already airborne, 3 large Chinooks carrying supplies, and personnel to Outpost Eagle. Sarah positioned her Apache to provide overwatch, flying a pattern that would allow her to scan the surrounding terrain for threats while staying close enough to respond quickly if needed. The flight to Outpost Eagle took 45 minutes, crossing over desert terrain dotted with villages and agricultural areas. Sarah kept her eyes moving constantly, scanning for any signs of enemy activity. Gonzalez monitored the aircraft's sensors and maintained radio contact with the transport crews. Everything seemed routine until they reached the halfway point of their journey. Sarah noticed something that made her pause. In a small valley below, partially hidden by trees and rocks, she spotted what looked like vehicle tracks in the sand. The tracks were recent, made within the last day or two based on their sharp edges and lack of wind erosion. Gonzalez, take a look at grid reference 456789, Sarah said, marking the location on her display. Tell me what you see. Gonzalez studied the area through her targeting system. Looks like tire tracks. Could be civilian vehicles, but they're in a pretty remote area. Sarah continued to study the tracks as they flew past. Something about the pattern bothered her. The vehicles had moved in a tactical formation, with spacing that suggested military training. Civilian vehicles would have moved in a single file or random pattern, but these tracks showed the kind of discipline that came from professional soldiers. Transport lead, this is Overwatch, Sarah radioed to the lead Chinook. I'm seeing some suspicious activity below our flight path. Recommend we alter course to avoid potential threats. The transport pilot's voice came back immediately. Overwatch, we're on a tight schedule. Command wants us at Eagle in 30 minutes. Can you confirm hostile activity? Sarah hesitated. She couldn't prove the tracks belonged to enemy forces. They could have been made by local farmers or legitimate military patrols. But her instincts told her something was wrong. The tracks were too fresh, too organized, and in exactly the kind of location where enemy forces would position themselves to attack helicopters. Negative confirmation on hostiles, Sarah admitted. But I strongly recommend course change as a precaution. Copy that, Overwatch. We'll stay on current flight path, maintain Overwatch, and report any definite threats. Sarah bit her tongue to keep from arguing. She understood the pressure the transport crews were under. Delays meant missed schedules, which meant angry commanders and potential supply shortages at remote outposts. But her training told her to trust her instincts, even when she couldn't prove them right. She decided to adjust her own flight pattern slightly, moving to a position where she could better observe the area where she had seen the tracks. If enemy forces were waiting in ambush, they would reveal themselves when the transports passed overhead. 20 minutes later, Sarah's caution proved justified in the worst possible way. As the 3 Chinooks approached a narrow pass between 2 hills, muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions on both sides of the valley. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the air toward the transport helicopters, while machine gun fire filled the sky with deadly tracers. Taking fire! Taking fire! Screamed the voice of transport lead over the radio. We're under attack from both sides of the pass. Sarah immediately pushed her Apache into a diving attack run, her mind shifting into combat mode with crystalline clarity. Everything she had trained for, everything she had studied and practiced, came together in a moment of perfect focus. She could see the enemy positions clearly now, muzzle flashes revealing fighters hidden among rocks and scrubby vegetation. Gonzalez, multiple targets at 10 and 2 o'clock, Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. I count at least 8 firing positions. I see them, Gonzalez replied, already working to lock on targets with the Apache's weapon systems. Holy shit, there's a lot of them. One of the transport helicopters was trailing smoke, its pilot struggling to maintain control as bullets punched holes in the aircraft's skin. Another Chinook was trying to turn away from the ambush, but enemy fire was coming from multiple directions. The third transport had taken a direct hit from an RPG and was auto-rotating toward the ground, its crew fighting to survive the emergency landing. Sarah felt time slow down as her training took over completely. She had spent hundreds of hours in flight simulators, practicing exactly this kind of scenario. Her instructors had drilled her on target prioritization, weapons employment, and tactical maneuvering until every response became automatic. Now, facing her first real combat situation, all of that training crystallized into action. The Apache's targeting system locked onto the first enemy position, where she could see fighters with RPG launchers preparing to fire again at the damaged transports. Sarah triggered a Hellfire missile, watching as the precision-guided weapon streaked toward the target. The explosion sent rocks and debris flying as the missile eliminated the launcher team. But there were many more targets, and the transport helicopters were sitting ducks in the narrow valley. Sarah realized that a conventional attack approach wouldn't work. The enemy had positioned themselves too well, with overlapping fields of fire that would make it difficult for her to engage all the positions before the transports were destroyed. Instead, she made a decision that would have seemed reckless to anyone watching, but which made perfect tactical sense given the situation. She turned the Apache directly toward the most heavily defended enemy position and began a low-level attack run that would take her between the hills and directly through the enemy's field of fire. "Martinez, what are you doing?" Major Thompson's voice crackled over the radio from his aircraft, which was still several minutes away. "Pull back and wait for support." But Sarah didn't respond to the radio call. She was completely focused on the battle, her mind calculating angles and distances with the precision of a computer. She could see exactly what needed to be done, and she knew that waiting for support would mean watching the transport crews die. The Apache screamed through the valley at maximum speed, its 30mm chain gun spitting death at enemy positions. Sarah's gunnery was flawless, each burst finding its target with surgical precision. Enemy fighters who had felt safe in their concealed positions suddenly found themselves under attack from an angle they hadn't expected. Gonzalez was working frantically to keep up with the target-rich environment. "Target left, target right, target dead ahead," she called out as Sarah maneuvered the Apache through the deadly gauntlet. "Jesus, Martinez, you're flying like a mad woman." But Sarah's flying was a madness. Every movement was calculated, every turn designed to minimize exposure while maximizing the effectiveness of her weapons. She had studied this kind of terrain in training, learning how to use the natural features of hills and valleys to mask her approach and confuse enemy gunners. A rocket-propelled grenade passed so close to the Apache that Sarah could feel the heat from its exhaust, but her concentration never wavered. She was completely in the zone, operating at a level of skill that she had never achieved before. Every system in the helicopter was responding perfectly to her commands. Every weapon was firing exactly where she aimed. The enemy fighters had expected an easy victory against slow-moving transport helicopters, but they had never planned for an Apache pilot willing to take the fight directly to them. Sarah's aggressive tactics caught them completely off guard, disrupting their carefully planned ambush and forcing them to shift their attention from the transports to defending themselves. In the space of 3 minutes, Sarah had destroyed 5 enemy positions and scattered the rest. The surviving enemy fighters were abandoning their weapons and fleeing into the rocks. Their ambush turned into a rout. The transport helicopters, though damaged, had managed to escape the kill zone and were limping towards safety. As Sarah pulled the Apache out of the valley and climbed to a safer altitude, she could hear amazed voices on the radio. The transport crews were calling out their thanks, their voices filled with relief and disbelief. Major Thompson's voice cut through the chatter with a tone she had never heard from him before. "Overwatch, this is Squadron Lead. What's your status?" Sarah checked her instruments and found that despite flying through intense enemy fire, the Apache had suffered only minor damage. "Squadron Lead, Overwatch is green on all systems. Enemy ambush has been neutralized. Transport flight is clear to proceed." There was a long pause before Thompson responded. Copy that, Overwatch. Outstanding work. We'll debrief when you return to base. As Sarah escorted the damaged transports to safety, she could feel that something fundamental had changed. The quiet, ordinary pilot who had walked into the briefing room that morning was gone, replaced by someone who had proven herself in the crucible of combat. She had saved the lives of 12 crew members and dozens of passengers, turning what should have been a disaster into a victory. But Sarah didn't feel like celebrating. She was already thinking about the mission report she would have to write, analyzing every decision she had made and every shot she had fired. She knew that this was just the beginning, that word of her performance would spread quickly through the squadron. When they landed back at Forward Operating Base Thunder, a crowd had gathered on the flight line. Word of the successful defense had already reached the base, and everyone wanted to see the pilot who had turned an ambush into a victory. As Sarah shut down the Apache and climbed out of the cockpit, she was greeted by applause from the ground crews and other pilots. Lieutenant Jackson was among the first to approach her, his earlier mockery replaced by genuine respect. Martinez, that was incredible flying. I heard you took on 8 positions by yourself and won. Sarah shrugged modestly. I had good training and a good gunner. We just did our job. But Major Thompson had a different perspective when he pulled her aside for the initial debrief. Captain, what you did today was far beyond just doing your job. You saved lives and turned a potential disaster into a tactical victory. That kind of flying takes skill, courage, and tactical thinking that can't be taught. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already moving ahead to the next mission. She had tasted combat and proven herself capable, but she knew that this was just the first test. The enemy would learn from today's defeat and adapt their tactics. The war was far from over, and she would need to stay sharp if she wanted to keep protecting the people who depended on her. As the sun set over the base that evening, Sarah sat in her quarters, writing her mission report. She described the engagement in precise, professional language, noting enemy tactics, weapons used, and lessons learned. But between the lines of military terminology was the story of a pilot who had discovered what she was truly capable of when everything was on the line. The other pilots might have seen her as ordinary before today, but Sarah had always known there was something more inside her waiting for the right moment to emerge. Today had been that moment, and now everyone else knew it too. The quiet, careful pilot was still there, but she had been joined by something else, a warrior who could fly through hell and emerge victorious on the other side. Tomorrow would bring new missions and new challenges, but Sarah faced them with a confidence she had never felt before. She had been tested in combat and proven herself worthy of the Apache she flew and the lives she protected. The war was far from over, but Captain Sarah Martinez was ready for whatever came next. 3 weeks after the transport rescue, Captain Sarah Martinez found herself facing a completely different kind of mission. The intelligence briefing room was packed with senior officers, their faces grim as they studied satellite photos and tactical maps spread across the long conference table. Sarah sat quietly in the back, wondering why she had been called to attend a planning session that seemed far above her pay grade. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, stood at the front of the room, pointing to aerial photographs that showed a fortified compound in mountainous terrain. Gentlemen, ladies, we have a situation that requires immediate action. Our sources indicate that a high-value target is meeting with local terrorist leaders at this compound in exactly 72 hours. Sarah studied the photographs as they were passed around the room. The compound sat on a rocky plateau, surrounded by steep cliffs and narrow mountain passes. It looked like a medieval fortress with high walls, guard towers, and what appeared to be heavy weapons positioned at strategic points. Getting close to a target like that would be nearly impossible for ground forces. The target is Commander Rashid Hassan, Colonel Harrison continued. He's been coordinating attacks against our forces for the past 6 months, and intelligence believes he's planning something major. This meeting represents our best chance to eliminate him and disrupt the entire terrorist network in this region. Major Thompson leaned forward in his chair. What's the tactical situation, sir? That compound looks like it could hold off an entire battalion. You're exactly right, Major. Intelligence estimates between 50 and 70 fighters, plus heavy machine guns, rocket launchers, and possibly anti-aircraft missiles. The terrain makes a conventional assault extremely difficult, and we can't get close enough for special operations forces to infiltrate without being detected. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand why she might have been called to this briefing. The compound's position and defenses made it nearly impossible to attack with ground forces, but there might be another way. She raised her hand tentatively. Sir, has anyone considered a helicopter assault? Colonel Harrison looked at her with interest. Captain Martinez, isn't it? I understand you had quite a performance 3 weeks ago. He turned to address the room. Captain Martinez successfully defended a transport convoy against an organized ambush, destroying multiple enemy positions in a single engagement. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as the senior officers turned to look at her. She wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, but she forced herself to focus on the tactical problem. Sir, the compound defenses are designed to stop ground assault and conventional air attack, but they might not be optimized against low-level helicopter approach from unexpected angles. Explain your thinking, Captain. Sarah stood and approached the tactical map, studying the terrain features around the target compound. The mountains create natural flight corridors that could mask an approach. If we came in at extremely low altitude, following the valley systems, we might be able to get close enough for a precision strike before they could respond effectively. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, the operations officer, shook his head skeptically. Captain, that terrain is some of the most dangerous flying country in the region. The valleys are narrow, the winds are unpredictable, and one mistake would mean flying into a cliff face. Plus, we'd have to fly below radar coverage, which means no navigation assistance and no way to call for help if something goes wrong. Yes, sir, Sarah acknowledged. It would be extremely dangerous, but it might be the only way to reach the target before he disappears again. Colonel Harrison studied the map for several minutes, his finger tracing possible flight routes through the mountainous terrain. Captain Martinez, in your professional opinion, is this mission feasible? Sarah considered the question carefully. Everything about the proposed mission screamed danger. The terrain was treacherous, the target was heavily defended, and they would be operating at the absolute limits of the Apache's capabilities. One mistake, one mechanical failure, one moment of lost concentration could mean death for her and her crew. But she also understood what was at stake. Commander Hassan was responsible for the deaths of dozens of coalition soldiers. Intelligence indicated he was planning an attack that could kill hundreds of innocent civilians. If they let this opportunity pass, how many more people would die? Sir, it's feasible, but it would require perfect execution. We need to study the terrain extensively, plan for multiple contingencies, and accept a high level of risk. But yes, I think it can be done. The room fell silent as the senior officers considered her assessment. Major Thompson was the first to speak. Colonel, if we're seriously considering this, Martinez is the right pilot for the job. After what she did 3 weeks ago, I have complete confidence in her abilities. What kind of force would you need, Captain? Colonel Harrison asked. Sarah thought quickly. 2 Apaches would be optimal, sir. 1 for the primary attack, and 1 for backup and overwatch. We need complete tactical surprise, so timing would be critical. And we need detailed intelligence on the compound's defenses and the exact location of the target. The intelligence indicates the meeting will take place in the main building at the center of the compound, Colonel Harrison said. Our sources suggest it will begin at sunset and last approximately 2 hours. That gives us a narrow window when we know Hassan will be stationary. Over the next 48 hours, Sarah threw herself into mission planning with an intensity that surprised even her. She studied every satellite photograph, every intelligence report, every piece of information about the target compound and surrounding terrain. She memorized the elevation of every mountain peak, the width of every valley, the location of every known defensive position. The weather forecast was mixed. High winds were expected in the mountains, with possible cloud cover that could both help and hinder the mission. Cloud cover would provide concealment for the approach, but it would also make navigation more difficult and increase the risk of flying into terrain. Sarah's gunner for the mission would be Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a veteran crew member known for his steady nerves and excellent marksmanship. They spent hours in the flight simulator practicing low-level flight through mountainous terrain and emergency procedures for every possible scenario. "This is crazy, you know that, right?" Rodriguez said during one of their planning sessions. "Flying through those mountains at night below radar with no backup if something goes wrong." "I know," Sarah admitted, "but it's also the only way to get Hassan. He's too well protected for conventional attack, and ground forces would never get close enough." The second Apache would be flown by Captain Williams, an experienced pilot with over 200 combat hours. His gunner was Sergeant Peterson, another veteran crew member. Williams had initially been skeptical of the mission, but as they worked through the planning details, he became convinced it could succeed. "The key is going to be navigation," Williams said during their final briefing. "We'll be flying in radio silence until we reach the target, which means dead reckoning all the way. One wrong turn, and we're either lost or splattered against a mountainside." Sarah had spent so much time studying the route that she could fly it with her eyes closed. Every landmark was burned into her memory, every potential hazard identified and planned for. She had even identified emergency landing sites along the route in case of mechanical failure. The night of the mission arrived with clear skies and moderate winds. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection by flashlight, checking every system twice. The Apache carried a full load of ammunition and fuel, plus special equipment for night flying in mountainous terrain. At exactly 2,100 hours, both Apaches lifted off from forward operating base Thunder and headed into the mountains. They flew without navigation lights, using night vision goggles to see the terrain ahead. Radio communications were kept to an absolute minimum to avoid detection by enemy listening posts. The first part of the flight followed a well-known route used by regular patrols, but after 20 minutes, they turned into unmapped territory. Sarah led the formation into a narrow valley that would take them deep into the mountains, following a route she had planned to avoid known enemy positions. Flying at night through mountainous terrain was one of the most dangerous things a helicopter pilot could do. The valleys were narrow and winding, with rocky walls that rose hundreds of feet on both sides. There was no margin for error, no room for hesitation or doubt. Sarah had to trust her instruments, her training, and her memory of the terrain features she had studied so intensively. "Valley's getting narrower," Rodriguez warned, his voice tense as he watched the rocky walls slide past their aircraft. "We got maybe 50 feet of clearance on each side." "I see it," Sarah replied, her hands steady on the controls despite the challenging conditions. "The valley opens up again in about 2 miles. Just need to stay centered and maintain altitude." Behind them, Captain Williams was having a harder time with the difficult flying conditions. His Apache was slightly larger and heavier than Sarah's, making it more difficult to maneuver in the confined space. Twice he had to make sharp corrections to avoid the valley walls. After 90 minutes of nerve-wracking mountain flying, they reached the final valley that would take them to the target compound. Sarah checked her watch and saw they were exactly on schedule. Intelligence had confirmed that the meeting was taking place as planned, with Hassan's vehicle spotted arriving at the compound 30 minutes earlier. "Target area coming up," Sarah whispered into her microphone. 2 minutes to weapons release. The compound appeared ahead of them as they crested a small ridge, its lights visible against the dark mountainside. Sarah could see guard towers and defensive positions exactly where the intelligence reports had predicted. The main building sat in the center of the compound, with vehicles parked nearby